US President Donald Trump says he's cancelled a secret meeting with the Taliban in the United States. Leaders were supposed to fly to Camp David on Saturday night. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says talks with the Taliban are now dead for the time being, and the special envoy is being recalled. Meetings between him and the Taliban had been going on in Qatar for nearly a year.
And it was the case that when the Taliban tried to gain negotiating advantage by conducting terror attacks inside of the country, President Trump made the right decision to say that's not going to work. We're going to walk away from a deal if others try to use violence to achieve better ends in a negotiation. It's not right. It's not appropriate. It killed an American, and it made no sense for the Taliban to be rewarded for that kind of bad behavior.
Well, the Taliban has released a statement in response saying Americans will suffer more than anyone else because of Trump's decision to cancel the talks, while the office of Afghan President Ashraf Ghani says peace will only be possible if the Taliban stop launching attacks and hold direct talks with the government.
We expected an outcome that could lead us to a ceasefire, that could lead us to a direct negotiation with the Afghan government and the Taliban. So unfortunately, that's we didn't see. On contrary, we saw and we observed that there could be risks to any process that the Afghan government is not the main stakeholder in that. And any process that cannot guarantee a ceasefire, a halt to the violence, could be harmful for all of the achievements that we've gained.
Well, Tony Burley is standing by in Kabul. But first, let's go to Rob Reynolds in Washington, D.C. Rob, how is the news of this cancellation playing out there?
Well, certainly there was a lot of shock, Rob, when President Trump tweeted on Saturday that there had been this meeting planned for Camp David. Camp David, of course, is a very historically significant place. And many wondered whether the idea of having the Taliban leadership go to meet with the president there was appropriate. But now that the meeting is off, people are saying that the president made the right call, at least those within his own inner circle. As you just heard from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he said that the talks are dead for the time being. He gave no indication as to whether or when they might restart. Secretary Pompeo also warned that things are about to get worse, in his words, for the Taliban after the killing of a U.S. soldier in a car bomb attack in Kabul on Thursday. Now, members of the president's own party, as well as members of his inner circle, including the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, had been dubious about the talks with the Taliban. They had been counseling the president that the Taliban's word could not be taken at face value and that the organization could not be trusted to keep its promises. But the president has made promises of his own, namely that he would withdraw the remaining 14,000 U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Not to do so or to not be able to fulfill that pledge could have political repercussions for Trump. And Trump has used this tactic before, Rob, both as a businessman and as president, of walking away from a deal in the final stages if he felt that he could get a better position or a strengthened negotiating position by doing so. You will recall that in the run-up to his first meeting with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, he abruptly canceled the talks, and then the talks were back on after a fairly short time. So it would not be surprising, I think, for many in Washington to find out that after a certain period of time, the talks were to resume. But that is completely up to President Trump.
Rob, for now, thanks very much indeed. I want to go to Tony Burley, who's with us from Kabul. Obviously, the Afghan government has essentially been sidelined from many of the talks that Rob's been talking about there. What's the reaction been there?
Well, in public, they're very supportive of the American peace process. In private, they have been very critical. But today, they're welcoming this move by the US president. They've always said that they should be party to these talks. The Taliban refuse to talk directly to the Afghan government. They consider them puppets of the Americans and illegitimate and corrupt. Ironically, the way this has all played out, that the Taliban said that they were close to an agreement whereby they were going to start talking with the Afghan government on September the 23rd. They perhaps have been the most surprised by this tweet from Donald Trump, because they were expecting this draft agreement to be a done deal. They said they were talking on Saturday with Mr. Khalilzad, the chief US negotiator, and according to a statement they've released today, that they said that both sides were in total agreement. The agreement was finalised. International and regional countries had been in agreement with this, and they were very surprised that this has been stopped at this stage. They tweeted positive statements on Saturday, so this has come as a shock to them. But they also said in their statement that America, as you said before, would suffer more than they would. Now, that's anyone's guess what that's going to mean. There's two choices facing the Taliban now. Do they go away, escalate the conflict, or do they come back to the negotiating table at some point in a different frame of mind? We're trying to wait and see which frame of mind that will be.
Tony, thanks very much indeed. Let's talk to David Sedney. He's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia. He's joining us on Skype from Kabul. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for giving us your time. One watching from the outside will get the sense that we were reaching a significant moment in these talks if this secret meeting was supposed to be held at Camp David. Do you think, given your diplomatic background, sir, that the president's reaction and response has been proportionate?
I would say that certainly from my perspective here in Kabul, talking to Afghans, I think the majority of people that I speak to welcome this decision. The fact that this agreement was reached earlier in the week and then followed by a wave of attacks on Afghan cities in the north and the west of the country, and then by a brutal bombing here in Kabul, sent the message to Afghans that the Taliban were not interested in peace. Their focus was on military victory, and that the U.S. agreement was a withdrawal agreement, not a peace agreement. So from that perspective, I think there is clearly a lot of work to be done. The Taliban are claiming that the U.S. will suffer, but in fact, it's Afghan civilians who are suffering the most. They're the ones who are being killed every day by the Taliban and in the crossfire between the Taliban and government forces. But by and large, I think most Afghans think this is the right thing. Many would love to have seen peace, but they didn't think the agreement that the U.S. brought was going to be a peace agreement.
We heard earlier on US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that the deal was essentially dead for now. What does it take, do you think, to try to get this process back on the road again?
I think it will take really a mindset change on the part of the Taliban. They have to show that they want peace, that they are willing to stop using violence. If they do that, then the talks can resume. But right now, again, the very direct, not just signals, the actions by the Taliban over the last week have been exactly the opposite, that they're interested in military victory, not in peace. And how that's going to play out inside the Taliban is a difficult question.
Give us some context on that, sir, if you would. How much of a disconnect is there between the Taliban members who are going through the negotiation process and are at the leadership, and the Taliban groups on the ground, and perhaps outside influences as well, who perhaps do not want this peace process to work?
Well, I'm not inside the Taliban, so I can't say that with certainty, but it does appear that there's a fairly large disconnect between the Taliban negotiators and what the Taliban commanders were doing. This coordinated assault across northern and western Afghanistan on 4 provincial capitals was not something that they did on the spur of the moment. It had to have been carefully planned, carefully thought out, a lot of logistics put in place before these attacks took place. And it doesn't appear that the existence of this agreement in Doha made any difference to the military commanders here. So I think it's very much an open question as to whether the Taliban speak with one voice.
Thank you very much indeed for giving us your analysis. David Sedney, we appreciate it. Thank you.